This HOA president nominated herself for the world's stupidest person list with just one 911 call. She boldly called the cops to my private log cabin at 10 a.m., accusing me of illegal gathering. She thought she was about to catch some terrorist plot red-handed, completely unaware that the people gathering that day all carried a type of ID that local police could only look at, then stand at attention. And that call, which she thought would get me arrested, became the most expensive disaster in her HOA's history. There are some people you should never mess with, especially when they're in civilian clothes on their day off. Comment below and let us know where you're watching from, because this story will make you say, absolutely unbelievable. Let me take you back to that Saturday morning that changed everything. I'm Marcus Rodriguez, though my team calls me Tank, and I inherited this beautiful log cabin from my grandfather about 3 years ago. It sits on the edge of Pine Valley Estates, a gated community where every blade of grass seems to have its own HOA regulation. The cabin was my sanctuary, the one place where I could shed the weight of my job and just breathe. After spending weeks dealing with high-stress situations that most people only see in movies, this place was my lifeline to normalcy. That particular Saturday started like any other weekend. I'd invited 4 of my closest colleagues over for what we'd been calling our decompression sessions. These weren't wild parties or anything dramatic, just 5 guys in their 30s trying to unwind from jobs that demanded everything we had. We'd usually fire up the grill, crack open some beers, and spend the day doing absolutely nothing productive. It was therapeutic in a way that most people wouldn't understand. When you spend your weekdays dealing with life and death situations, sometimes the most rebellious thing you can do is wear shorts and flip-flops and argue about whether the burgers are done. Around 10 a.m., we were in full relaxation mode. I was wearing my favorite pair of cargo shorts, a faded Marines t-shirt, and flip-flops that had seen better days. My buddies were similarly dressed, looking like any group of friends enjoying a weekend barbecue. Brass Thompson, built like a linebacker with a laugh that could wake the dead, was manning the grill while telling us about his latest fishing disaster. Sage Chen, quiet and observant as always, was setting up chairs with the precision he brought to everything. Phoenix Williams was organizing our drinks with the same methodical approach he used for everything else. And Ghost Martinez was already claiming the best spot in the shade. The only things that might have seemed unusual to an outsider were small details that meant nothing to us. We had a couple of walkie-talkies sitting on the picnic table because we'd forgotten to turn them off after our last shift. Our gear bags were visible in the back of my truck because we'd been too tired to unload them the night before. These were just the everyday remnants of our work life bleeding into our time, as normal to us as a teacher bringing home papers to grade. What I didn't know was that across the street, Prudence Whitmore was conducting her surveillance operation. Prue, as she insisted everyone call her, was 52 years old and had never met a rule she didn't want to enforce or a neighbor she didn't want to control. She'd been the HOA president for 3 years, ever since she'd moved to Pine Valley Estates, following what she called a fresh start from her previous community. I'd had exactly 2 interactions with her in the time I'd lived there, both involving complaints about noise levels during previous gatherings that were objectively quieter than most people's dinner conversations. From her living room window, armed with a pair of binoculars that she'd justified buying for bird watching, Prue was building her case against us. She saw 5 men who looked, in her words, suspiciously organized. She noticed the walkie-talkies and immediately jumped to the conclusion that we were coordinating something illegal. The fact that we moved with what she perceived as military precision, a habit we couldn't shake even in civilian clothes, only reinforced her growing paranoia. In her mind, we weren't 5 friends barbecuing. We were a threat that needed to be neutralized. The irony was that if Prue had simply walked over and introduced herself like a normal neighbor, she would have learned exactly who we were and what we did for a living. But Prue wasn't interested in facts when she had a perfectly good conspiracy theory brewing. She'd convinced herself that our previous gatherings had been reconnaissance missions, and that today's barbecue was the prelude to something sinister. The woman who prided herself on being the community's guardian had created an enemy where none existed. As I flipped burgers and listened to Brass's fishing stories, I had no idea that my peaceful Saturday was about to become the center of a storm that would expose just how dangerous it can be to make assumptions about people you don't know. I also had no idea that the woman watching us through binoculars was about to make a decision that would cost her everything she thought she was protecting. The morning air was perfect, warm but not hot, with just enough breeze to keep the smoke from the grill from bothering anyone. We were discussing whether to start a poker game later when Ghost noticed something that made him pause mid-sentence. "Hey, Tank," he said, pointing toward Prue's house. Isn't that the HOA lady who complained about us before? I followed his gaze and saw a figure quickly duck away from a window, binoculars glinting in the sunlight. Yeah, that's Prue, I said, not particularly concerned. She's probably just making sure we're not violating some obscure noise ordinance. The guys laughed, and we went back to our conversation, completely unaware that Prue was at that very moment reaching for her phone, convinced she was about to save the neighborhood from a clear and present danger. Looking back, I wonder if things might have gone differently if I'd walked over there right then, introduced myself properly, maybe invited her to join us for a burger. But I was tired from a long week, content in my little bubble of normalcy, and honestly, I figured live and let live was the best policy. I had no way of knowing that Prue had already decided we were the enemy, and that she was about to make a phone call that would turn a peaceful Saturday morning into a day none of us would ever forget. What happened next would go down in Pine Valley Estates' history as the most expensive misunderstanding ever recorded. At exactly 10:15 a.m., while I was debating with Brass about whether the burgers needed another 2 minutes, Prue was dialing 911 with the conviction of someone who genuinely believed she was saving America from imminent doom. I wish I could have been a fly on the wall during that call, because according to the recording I'd hear later, it was a masterpiece of paranoid delusion delivered with the confidence of an eyewitness to a crime. 911. What's your emergency? The dispatcher asked, probably expecting another cat-stuck-in-tree situation or maybe a fender-bender report. Instead, she got Prue at her most dramatic. I need to report suspicious terrorist activity at 1247 Maple Ridge Drive, Prue announced, her voice trembling with what she thought was patriotic urgency. There's a group of men with communication equipment who appear to be planning something dangerous. They've been conducting what looks like reconnaissance for weeks, and today they're gathered with suspicious equipment. I believe they're preparing for some kind of attack. The dispatcher, trained to take all calls seriously, began asking the standard questions. How many individuals? 5 large men, all appearing to be military-aged and physically fit. What kind of equipment? Radio communication devices, organized gear bags, and they're moving with obvious tactical coordination. Any weapons visible? I can't see weapons from here, but their behavior is highly suspicious and coordinated. The dispatcher dutifully recorded every word, flagging the call as a potential terrorist threat that would require immediate response. What made this call particularly expensive was Prue's insistence on escalating the drama. They've been watching the neighborhood for weeks, she continued, apparently referring to our previous weekend barbecues. Today feels different, more organized, more purposeful. I'm genuinely afraid for my community's safety. The dispatcher, following protocol for potential terrorist activities, immediately contacted Sheriff Dale Morrison and recommended sending a full tactical response team. 4 patrol cars, 8 officers, and a supervisor would be dispatched to handle what the system now classified as a possible domestic terrorism situation. Sheriff Morrison, a 20-year veteran who'd seen every kind of call imaginable, felt something nagging at him when he heard the address, 1247 Maple Ridge Drive. He knew that address, though it took him a moment to place it. Then it hit him like a freight train. Marcus Rodriguez lived there. Tank Rodriguez, the guy he'd served with in Afghanistan before Tank joined the SWAT team. Morrison had been to Tank's cabin exactly once, for a barbecue about 6 months ago, and he remembered thinking how peaceful the place was, how it seemed like the perfect retreat for someone in Tank's line of work. Morrison stared at the dispatch report, reading Prue's description of 5 military-aged males with tactical coordination and communication equipment. A slow smile spread across his face as he realized what was happening at 1247 Maple Ridge Drive. Tank was having his usual weekend decompression session with his SWAT team colleagues. The suspicious tactical coordination was probably them deciding who was in charge of the grill. The communication equipment was likely their work radios that they'd forgotten to turn off. And the reconnaissance activities Prue had been reporting for weeks were just guys trying to relax on their days off. But Morrison faced a dilemma. Protocol demanded that he treat every terrorist threat seriously, regardless of his knowledge of the situation. He couldn't just dismiss the call because he knew the suspects. However, he could certainly make sure he was part of the response team to prevent any unnecessary escalation. Morrison grabbed his keys and radio, calling ahead to the responding units. "I'll be taking point on this one," he told them. "And remember, we go in calm and professional. No unnecessary drama until we assess the actual situation." Meanwhile, back at the cabin, we were blissfully unaware that we'd been classified as a potential domestic terror cell. I was explaining to Phoenix why his method of organizing condiments was unnecessarily complicated when we heard the first siren in the distance. None of us thought much of it initially. Emergency vehicles were common enough in any residential area, and we assumed someone had called for medical assistance or there was a minor traffic incident nearby. The sirens got closer, and Sage, whose situational awareness never fully turned off even on weekends, paused mid-conversation. "Those are coming this way," he said, standing up from his chair and scanning the street. Ghost joined him, and within seconds, both men had unconsciously shifted into their professional postures. Years of training don't just disappear because you're wearing flip-flops instead of tactical boots. "Probably just passing through," I said, though I was starting to feel that familiar tingle of awareness that came with years of emergency response work. The sirens were getting closer, and there were multiple vehicles involved. Brass turned off the grill and moved to where he could see the street better. Phoenix had already started scanning for potential problems or threats, his medical training making him automatically assess our surroundings for anything that might require attention. None of us was particularly worried yet, but we'd all unconsciously transitioned from weekend relaxation mode to professional awareness mode. It's funny how training kicks in, even when you're convinced there's no real reason for concern. We stood there in our civilian clothes, cold beers in hand, looking like any group of friends at a barbecue, but internally we'd all shifted into the mindset that had kept us alive in dozens of high-stakes situations. The sirens were almost on top of us now. And that's when I saw the first patrol car turn onto Maple Ridge Drive, followed immediately by a second, then a third, then a fourth. All are heading directly toward my cabin. 4 police cruisers with flashing lights and wailing sirens pulling up to your house tend to get your attention pretty quickly. What happened next would become the stuff of legend among local law enforcement, a story that would be told and retold for years to come. As the vehicles came to a stop in my driveway and along the street, 8 police officers emerged with the kind of focused intensity that comes with responding to a potential terrorist threat. Their hands weren't on their weapons yet, but they were positioned for quick access, and their body language screamed high alert. I set my beer down on the picnic table and exchanged glances with my teammates. Without saying a word, we'd all shifted into professional mode, our weekend relaxation evaporating faster than morning dew. Brass stepped away from the grill, Ghost moved to get a better view of the approaching officers, and Phoenix had already started calculating escape routes and cover positions, pure instinct from years of tactical training. Sage, ever the observer, was cataloging details about the response force while maintaining the calm demeanor that had made him our best sniper. The lead officer, a young guy who looked like he'd been on the force for maybe 2 years, approached us with his hand resting on his radio. "Good morning, gentlemen," he called out, his voice carrying that particular blend of authority and caution that police use when they're not sure what they're walking into. "We received a report of suspicious activity at this address. Mind if we ask you a few questions?" Behind him, the other officers had spread out in a loose perimeter, professional but ready for trouble. "Of course, officer," I replied, keeping my voice calm and my hands visible. This wasn't my first rodeo with law enforcement, though it was certainly the first time I'd been on this side of a potential misunderstanding. "What kind of suspicious activity are we talking about?" The young officer consulted his notepad, clearly trying to match the dispatch description with what he was seeing. 5 guys in shorts and t-shirts, standing around a barbecue grill. "We received a report of possible terrorist activity involving 5 military-aged males with communication equipment and tactical coordination," he read, and I could see the confusion starting to creep into his expression as he looked at our flip-flops and beer bottles. The caller described organized surveillance activities and suspicious equipment. Behind him, I noticed that one of the other officers was trying very hard not to smile. That's when I realized what had happened. Someone had called the cops on us for having a barbecue. Someone had looked at 5 friends grilling burgers and somehow concluded we were plotting domestic terrorism. The absurdity of it might have been funny if it weren't so potentially dangerous. Misunderstandings like this could escalate quickly if not handled properly. "Officer," I said, reaching slowly into my back pocket, "I think there's been a significant misunderstanding here." The young cop tensed slightly, his hand moving closer to his weapon, and I could see the other officers shifting their positions. "We're going to reach for our identification now, all of us, slowly and carefully. I think once you see what we're about to show you, This whole situation is going to make a lot more sense. Keep your hands where I can see them, the officer instructed. But I could hear uncertainty in his voice now. Something about our demeanor, our calm responses, our obvious familiarity with police procedures, was not matching the terrorist profile he'd been expecting to encounter. On three, I said to my teammates, and they all nodded understanding. 1, 2, 3. In perfect synchronization, all 5 of us slowly reached into our back pockets and withdrew our identification, not driver's licenses, not civilian ID cards, SWAT team badges and credentials that immediately changed the entire dynamic of the situation. The transformation was instantaneous and almost comical. The young officer's eyes went wide as he read the ID I held out to him. "Oh shit," he muttered under his breath, then quickly corrected himself. "Sorry, sir." Behind him, the other officers were having similar reactions as they processed what they were seeing. The tactical perimeter dissolved as 8 police officers suddenly found themselves standing at attention in front of 5 SWAT team members wearing flip-flops. That's when Sheriff Morrison's vehicle pulled up, and everything clicked into place. Morrison stepped out of his car with the kind of resigned expression that suggested he'd figured out exactly what kind of call he'd responded to. Well, he said, walking over with a grin spreading across his face. "Thank Rodriguez, you magnificent bastard. I should have known it was you when I saw the address." "Dale," I called out, relief flooding through me as I recognized my old military buddy. "Please tell me you're here to arrest Brass for his terrible burger flipping technique and not because someone thinks we're planning to overthrow the government." Morrison laughed, a deep belly laugh that immediately diffused the remaining tension in the air. "Gentlemen," Morrison announced to his officers, "allow me to introduce Marcus Tank Rodriguez, team leader of our regional SWAT unit, and his colleagues. These are the guys we call when we need the real professionals." The young officer who'd approached us first looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. The suspicious tactical coordination was probably them deciding who gets the last beer. The other officers began relaxing, some of them chuckling as they realized they'd just surrounded 5 of their colleagues with the kind of backup usually reserved for bank robberies. Phoenix offered the nearest officer a cold beer, which was politely declined but appreciated. Ghost was already firing up his charm, asking about their equipment and response time with genuine professional interest. But across the street, I could see a figure standing at a window, binoculars still in hand, watching our friendly reunion with what I could only imagine was growing horror. Prue was getting her first real look at the terrorists she'd reported, and seeing 8 police officers chatting casually with us like old friends was probably not the outcome she'd been expecting. "So, Tank," Morrison said, accepting the beer that Phoenix offered him, "want to tell me which of your neighbors decided you guys looked dangerous enough to warrant a full tactical response?" I pointed toward Prue's house, where the figure in the window quickly ducked out of sight. That would be our HOA president, Prudence Whitmore. 5 guys barbecuing on a Saturday morning constitutes a clear and present danger to national security. As Morrison and his officers prepared to leave, the reality of what had just happened started to sink in. What should have been a quiet Saturday morning barbecue had just cost the taxpayers of Pine Valley County a significant chunk of money. 4 patrol cars, 8 officers, 1 supervisor, and nearly 3 hours of total man-hours had been deployed to investigate 5 guys grilling burgers. Morrison, ever the professional, was already calculating the cost in his head, and I could see the mix of amusement and frustration on his face. "Thanks. I hate to be the bearer of bad news," Morrison said, pulling out his incident report clipboard, "but this little misunderstanding is going to cost the county about $1,200 in overtime and vehicle deployment costs. And that's just for today's response." He gestured toward the departing patrol cars. "We had to pull these units from their regular patrol routes, which means other areas of the county were temporarily understaffed. When someone calls in a possible terrorist threat, we don't mess around." I felt a familiar anger building in my chest, the same controlled fury that had gotten me through some of the worst situations I'd faced in both military and civilian service. Someone's paranoid delusions had just wasted public resources that could have been used to respond to actual emergencies. "Dale, I need to ask you for a favor," I said, keeping my voice level. "I want copies of all the documentation from this incident. The 911 call recording, the dispatch logs, the incident reports, everything." Morrison raised an eyebrow. "Planning to file a complaint?" he asked, though his tone suggested he thought that would be entirely reasonable under the circumstances. "Because I'll tell you right now, false reporting is a serious offense. especially when it involves potential terrorism claims. The DA's office doesn't take kindly to people who waste emergency resources on personal vendettas. I'm not sure it's a personal vendetta yet, I replied, though I was beginning to suspect it might be exactly that. But I want to understand the pattern here. This feels like more than just a one-time misunderstanding. Ghost, who had been quietly listening to our conversation while helping Brass clean up the grill, looked up with interest. As our team's intelligence specialist, he had an almost supernatural ability to spot patterns and connections that others missed. "Tank's right," Ghost said, wiping his hands on a towel. "I've been thinking about this while you guys were talking. The caller didn't just report suspicious activity, she specifically mentioned weeks of reconnaissance and tactical coordination. That suggests she's been watching us regularly, building some kind of case in her mind." He paused, considering his words carefully. That level of detail in the 911 call suggests either genuine paranoia or deliberate false reporting. Morrison nodded slowly. "I can get you the documentation, but it'll take a few days to process through official channels. The 911 recordings are public record anyway, so you're entitled to them." He hesitated for a moment, then continued. "Off the record, Tank, you might want to look into your neighbor's history with law enforcement, because this level of detailed false reporting usually isn't a first-time thing." After Morrison and his team left, the 5 of us sat around the picnic table, our relaxing weekend thoroughly derailed. The mood had shifted completely from casual fun to professional problem-solving mode. Phoenix, ever the practical one, was already pulling up information on his phone about HOA regulations and tenant rights. Sage was scanning the neighborhood, probably noting sightlines and potential observation points that our neighbor might be using for her surveillance activities. "You know what bothers me most about this?" Brass said, cracking open a fresh beer with perhaps more force than necessary. "It's not just that she called the cops on us for having a barbecue. It's that she put thought and planning into this. She watched us, took notes, built a narrative, and then presented it to 911 like she was reporting an actual crime in progress." I pulled out my phone and started making notes, falling back on investigative procedures that had become second nature over the years. "First thing we need to establish is whether this was an isolated incident or part of a pattern," I said, opening a new document. "Ghost, you said she mentioned weeks of surveillance. That suggests she's been planning this for a while." "More than that," Ghost replied, his analytical mind already working through the implications. "The specific language she used in the 911 call suggests she's done this before. People don't just naturally know how to phrase reports to trigger maximum law enforcement response unless they've had practice or training." Phoenix looked up from his phone with a concerned expression. "I've been reading through the Pine Valley HOA regulations, and there's nothing in here about gatherings of 5 people or less requiring any kind of notification or approval. She can't claim we violated HOA rules because we technically didn't." He scrolled through more text. "But here's something interesting. The HOA bylaws include specific penalties for residents who file false complaints or reports that waste community resources." That got my attention immediately. "What kind of penalties?" I asked, leaning over to look at his phone screen. The answer was more comprehensive than I'd expected. False reporting could result in fines, loss of HOA voting privileges, and, in extreme cases, forced sale of property if the behavior was deemed detrimental to community welfare. "Here's what we're going to do," I said, shifting into full tactical planning mode. "Phoenix, I want you to file a Freedom of Information Act request for all 911 calls originating from Prudence Whitmore's address in the past 2 years. If she's done this before, there will be a paper trail." Phoenix nodded and made a note on his phone. "Sage, I want you to discreetly check with some of our other neighbors. Find out if anyone else has had problems with her, especially anything involving law enforcement or HOA complaints." Sage grinned, the kind of expression that meant he was already planning his approach. "Brass, you've got contacts in the county clerk's office from your volunteer work, right? See if you can find out about any previous legal issues, civil complaints, or other public records involving our HOA president." Brass cracked his knuckles with enthusiasm. "Ghost, I want you to do what you do best. Deep background research, but keep it completely legal and above board. Public records, social media, anything that might give us insight into who we're dealing with and whether this is normal behavior for her." As for myself, I was going to start with a simple conversation. Despite my growing suspicion that Prue had acted deliberately and maliciously, I wanted to give her one chance to explain herself and make things right. Professional courtesy demanded that I approach this systematically rather than reactively, even though every instinct I had was telling me that we were dealing with someone who had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. One more thing, I added, looking around at my teammates. We document everything from this point forward. Every interaction, every piece of evidence, every conversation. If this escalates, and I have a feeling it will, we're going to need an airtight case. The guys nodded in understanding. We'd all been through enough legal proceedings to know that documentation was everything. What I didn't know yet was that Prue's 911 call was just the tip of an iceberg that would reveal a pattern of behavior far more extensive and expensive than any of us had imagined. What we discovered over the next 3 days would have been funny if it weren't so infuriating. My team's investigation into Prudence Whitmore revealed a pattern of behavior that was both more extensive and more costly than any of us had imagined. Phoenix's Freedom of Information Act request came back with results that made my jaw drop. In the past 18 months, Prue had called 911 exactly 12 times, and every single call had been classified as a false alarm after investigation. The progression of her calls told a disturbing story. It started with noise complaints that escalated to suspicious activity reports, then graduated to claims of potential criminal behavior, and finally reached the terrorism accusation that had brought 4 patrol cars to my barbecue. Each call had been more dramatic than the last, as if she was testing how far she could push the system before someone called her bluff. Ghost's background research painted an even more concerning picture. "Tank, you're not going to believe this," he said, calling me Monday evening with the kind of excitement that meant he'd found something significant. I cross-referenced Prue's address history with public records from her previous community in Riverside County. She was forced to sell her house there after the HOA filed a lawsuit against her for, and I quote, "chronic abuse of emergency services and harassment of neighbors through false reporting." The twist that knocked me sideways came from an unexpected source. When Sage started talking to our neighbors about their experiences with Prue, he discovered something that changed everything we thought we knew about the situation. Mrs. Chen, who lived 2 houses down from Prue, had a bombshell revelation that nobody saw coming. "Your HOA president isn't the homeowner," Mrs. Chen told Sage, during what was supposed to be a casual conversation about neighborhood issues. "She's listed as a property manager for an investment company called Whitmore Holdings. The actual owner lives in Florida and has never even seen the house." Mrs. Chen, a retired real estate attorney, had looked up the property records out of curiosity after one of Prue's previous complaints about her exotic cooking smells. This was our twist outside the normal flow of the story. Prue had been acting with the authority of a homeowner and HOA president, but she was essentially a tenant with delusions of grandeur. She had no legal standing to file most of the complaints she'd been making, and her position as HOA president was technically invalid since she wasn't actually a property owner in the community. When Phoenix dug deeper into the HOA's automated management system, he discovered another layer of the problem. The software tracks every incident that costs the community money, he explained, showing me his laptop screen. Every time someone calls 911 for a false alarm, the county bills the HOA for wasted resources. And get this, Tank, the system automatically calculates the financial impact and assigns responsibility to the reporting party. The numbers were staggering. Prue's 12 false 911 calls had cost the Pine Valley HOA community a total of $15,000 in emergency response fees, administrative costs, and increased insurance premiums. The software had been dutifully tracking these expenses and assigning them to her account, but since she wasn't technically responsible for HOA fees as a non-owner, the costs had been absorbed by the community fund that all the actual homeowners contributed to. But the most damaging discovery came when Brass's contact at the county clerk's office provided us with incident reports that we hadn't requested. Among Prue's 12 false calls was one that had tragic consequences. 3 months earlier, she had reported suspicious activity involving possible drug dealing at a house where a teenage birthday party was taking place. The responding ambulance and police units had been diverted from their normal patrol routes to investigate her false report. During the 47 minutes that emergency services were tied up with Prue's fabricated drug dealing scenario, an elderly man named Harold Morrison, no relation to Sheriff Morrison, had suffered a heart attack just 6 blocks away. The nearest ambulance had been delayed by 12 critical minutes because it was busy responding to Prue's false alarm. Harold Morrison had survived, but barely, and his recovery had been significantly complicated by the delay in receiving medical attention. That was the moment when this stopped being about hurt feelings or wasted money and became about genuine harm to innocent people. Prue's fantasy games with the emergency services had nearly cost an elderly man his life, and she had never been held accountable for it because the connection between her false report and the delayed medical response had never been officially investigated. This changes everything, I told the team when we gathered Tuesday evening to review our findings. We're not just dealing with someone annoying or paranoid. We're dealing with someone whose behavior is actively dangerous to the community she claims to be protecting. Sage, who had been unusually quiet during our discussion, finally spoke up. Thanks. There's something else. When I was talking to the neighbors about Prue, 3 different people mentioned that she's been asking questions about you specifically for weeks. Not about all of us, just you. She wanted to know your work schedule, whether you lived alone, and what kind of car you drove. Mrs. Patterson said Prue seemed almost obsessed with figuring out what you did for a living. That revelation added a personal dimension to the situation that made me deeply uncomfortable. This wasn't just a busybody neighbor with too much time on her hands. This was someone who had been conducting targeted surveillance on me specifically, trying to build some kind of case that would justify her escalating reports to law enforcement. Phoenix looked up from his laptop with the expression he got when he'd found something particularly significant. Thanks. I think you need to see this. Councilwoman Rita Vasquez received 23 formal complaints about Prue yesterday alone, all from Pine Valley residents who heard about the SWAT team incident and decided they'd had enough of her behavior. The investigation had revealed that Prue wasn't just a problem for me and my team. She was a problem for the entire community. A woman whose unchecked behavior had been escalating for months, while everyone suffered in silence, afraid to challenge the HOA president's authority. But now that her most recent false report had been exposed in such a dramatic way, the floodgates had opened. What none of us knew yet was that Prue was preparing her final gambit. One last desperate attempt to turn the tables and make herself the victim in a story where she was the villain. Prue's final gambit came exactly 1 week after the 911 incident, and it was even more audacious than anything she'd tried before. She called an emergency HOA meeting for Thursday evening, sending out a community-wide email with the subject line, "Urgent, Community Safety Threatened by Resident Abuse of Authority." The email claimed that I had been using my position as a SWAT team member to intimidate and harass her, preventing her from performing her duties as HOA president. She was demanding that the community vote to expel me from Pine Valley Estates for conduct detrimental to community welfare and safety. The irony was breathtaking. The woman who had filed 12 false police reports was now accusing me of abusing my authority because I had dared to investigate her pattern of false reporting. But Prue had made one critical miscalculation. She assumed that the community would rally behind their HOA president against an outsider. She had no idea that her reign of terror had made her more enemies than allies, and that my investigation had given those enemies the ammunition they needed to fight back. The community center was packed that Thursday evening. I counted at least 60 residents in attendance, far more than had ever shown up for a regular HOA meeting. The tension in the room was palpable as people filed in, whispering conversations buzzing with anticipation. Prue sat at the head table looking confident and self-righteous, clearly believing she was about to deliver the knockout punch that would eliminate her biggest problem. "Ladies and gentlemen," Prue began, standing up with the theatrical flair of someone who genuinely believed she was the hero of this story, "we are gathered here tonight to address a serious threat to our community's safety and well-being. One of our residents has been using his position in law enforcement to intimidate and silence anyone who dares to question his activities." Her voice trembled with what she probably thought was righteous indignation. "I have been targeted, harassed, and threatened simply for doing my job as your elected HOA president." She went on for another 10 minutes, painting herself as a brave defender of community values, who had been victimized by a rogue police officer who couldn't handle being held accountable for his actions. She claimed that my tactical coordination meetings were a threat to neighborhood peace, that my surveillance equipment created an atmosphere of fear, and that my abuse of police authority had made it impossible for her to perform her duties effectively. "I am asking you tonight to vote for the immediate expulsion of Marcus Rodriguez from our community," she concluded, her voice rising to an almost evangelical fervor. "We cannot allow anyone, regardless of their professional position, to use intimidation and authority to silence the democratic processes that keep our community safe." The applause was scattered and half-hearted, mostly from the 3 or 4 residents who seemed to support Prue regardless of circumstances. Most of the room sat in uncomfortable silence, waiting to see what would happen next. That's when I stood up, and the real fireworks began. "Thank you, Prue," I said, my voice calm and level despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "Before this community votes on anything, I think they deserve to know the complete truth about what's been happening here." I pulled out a manila folder thick with documents. "First, let me properly introduce myself to those of you who don't know me. My name is Marcus Rodriguez, and I am indeed a member of law enforcement." I reached into my back pocket and pulled out my SWAT team credentials, holding them up for the room to see. "This is my identification as the team leader of the regional SWAT unit. This is the badge that local police officers are trained to respect, because it represents years of service protecting communities just like this one." A murmur ran through the crowd as people leaned forward to get a better look. "The reason police officers stand at attention when they see this badge," I continued, "is because SWAT team members are the people they call when situations are too dangerous for regular patrol officers to handle. We're the ones who risk our lives to end hostage situations, stop armed criminals, and neutralize threats that could destroy entire communities." The room had gone completely silent now. 60 pairs of eyes focused on me with an almost physical intensity. Prue's confident expression was starting to crack as she realized that her narrative was about to be completely dismantled. "Now, let me tell you what happened last Saturday morning," I said, opening my folder. "At 10:15 a.m., while I was having a barbecue with 4 of my SWAT colleagues, all of us in civilian clothes on our day off, Prudence Whitmore called 911 to report what she claimed was potential terrorist activity." I pulled out the transcript of the 911 call and began reading directly from it. "I need to report suspicious terrorist activity," I read in a clear voice that carried to every corner of the room. "There's a group of men with communication equipment who appear to be planning something dangerous." The gasps from the audience were audible as the full absurdity of Prue's report sank in. This false report resulted in the deployment of 4 patrol cars, 8 police officers, and a supervisor, at a cost to our county of $1,200 in emergency response resources, I continued. "But that's just the beginning of the story." I pulled out Phoenix's research documents. Over the past 18 months, Prudence Whitmore has called 911 12 times, every single call resulting in a false alarm determination after investigation. The crowd was starting to shift now, angry murmurs rising as people began to understand the scope of what they were hearing. "The total cost of these false reports to our community has been $15,000 in emergency response fees, administrative costs, and increased insurance premiums," I announced. "Money that came directly out of the HOA fund that all of you contribute to." But the real bombshell was still coming. 3 months ago, one of Prudence's false reports diverted emergency services from responding to an actual medical emergency. An elderly man named Harold Morrison suffered a heart attack and had to wait an additional 12 minutes for medical assistance because the nearest ambulance was busy investigating Prudence's fabricated report of drug dealing at a teenager's birthday party. The room erupted. 60 people started talking at once, voices raised in anger and disbelief. Someone shouted, "That's unconscionable." From the back of the room, Mrs. Chen stood up and declared, "I move for an immediate vote of no confidence." The orderly HOA meeting had devolved into a community uprising, but I wasn't finished yet. "There's one more thing this community needs to know," I said, my voice cutting through the chaos. "Prudence Whitmore is not a homeowner in this community. According to county records, she is listed as a property manager for an investment company. The actual owner lives in Florida and has never seen this property. Technically, she has no legal standing to serve as HOA president, and most of her complaints over the past year have been filed without proper authority." That revelation was the final straw. Councilwoman Rita Vasquez, who had been sitting quietly in the back of the room, stood up and walked to the front. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "based on what I've heard tonight and the 23 formal complaints my office received this week, I am announcing an official investigation into the conduct of your HOA president. Effective immediately, Prudence Whitmore is suspended from all HOA duties, pending the outcome of this investigation." The vote was swift and decisive. 47 residents voted to remove Prue from her position immediately. 2 abstained. Only 1 person voted in her favor, and that was Prue herself. As the crowd began to disperse, Prue made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "I demand to call the police," she shouted over the noise of people filing out. This is harassment. This is intimidation. Ma'am, I replied with the kind of professional courtesy that I'd been trained to maintain even in the most ridiculous situations. You've already called the police. Multiple times. On us. That's how we got here. The few remaining residents burst into laughter, and even Rita Vasquez couldn't suppress a smile. The aftermath of that Thursday night meeting moved faster than anyone could have anticipated. By Friday morning, Prue was facing not just community exile but serious legal consequences that would make her the most expensive mistake in Pine Valley Estates' history. Rita Vasquez had wasted no time in escalating the investigation to the county level, and by noon, Prue had received official notification of criminal charges being filed against her. The legal paperwork was devastating in its thoroughness. 12 counts of false reporting to emergency services, each carrying a mandatory fine of $2,500 plus court costs. 1 count of filing a false terrorism report, which came with an additional $10,000 penalty under post-9/11's federal guidelines. Restitution payments totaling $15,000 for the emergency response costs she had generated. And because her position as HOA president had been fraudulent from the beginning, she was also facing charges of impersonating a community official and misrepresenting her authority to file official complaints. When Phoenix ran the numbers through the HOA's automated tracking system, the final tally was breathtaking. Prue's reign of terror had cost the Pine Valley community exactly $50,000 in direct expenses, legal fees, and increased insurance premiums. The software system helpfully displayed this information on the community bulletin board with the header, "Most costly mistake in HOA history." Minus $50, 000, in bright red letters that were visible every time someone entered the community center. But the financial devastation was only the beginning of Prue's problems. The property management company that owned her house had been completely unaware of her activities until Rita Vasquez contacted them as part of the official investigation. Whitmore Holdings, it turned out, was a small family investment firm run by Prue's elderly uncle in Tampa, who had hired her as a property manager specifically because he thought she would keep a low profile and avoid causing problems. When Uncle Harold Whitmore learned that his niece had been impersonating a homeowner, filing false police reports, and racking up tens of thousands of dollars in legal liabilities while supposedly managing his investment property, his response was swift and unforgiving. Prue received a certified letter, giving her 30 days to vacate the premises and find new employment. The letter also informed her that Whitmore Holdings would be pursuing civil action to recover any financial losses resulting from her unauthorized activities. The community's reaction to Prue's downfall was a mixture of relief, anger, and dark amusement. Mrs. Chen organized a neighborhood potluck to celebrate the return of peace, though she was tactful enough not to mention Prue by name in the invitation. Mr. Williams, whose grandson's birthday party had been the target of one of Prue's false drug-dealing reports, started a petition to have Prue's photo posted in the community center with a warning about the dangers of false reporting. For me, watching Prue's world collapse was both satisfying and oddly sad. I'd spent enough years in law enforcement to recognize the signs of someone whose need for control and attention had spiraled completely out of control. Prue hadn't started as a malicious person, I suspected. She'd probably begun with genuine concerns about community safety that had gradually warped into paranoid delusions and power trips. The irony wasn't lost on me that the woman who had called the police on 5 SWAT team members for having a barbecue was now desperately trying to avoid the legal consequences of her actions. When the sheriff's department served her with the criminal charges, she asked if she could call the police to report harassment. The deputy serving the papers had to explain that she was being charged by the police, not harassed by them. My teammates and I were officially cleared of any wrongdoing, though that had never really been in question. Sheriff Morrison sent us an official letter of apology on behalf of the county, along with an invitation to participate in a community relations barbecue that the police department was planning for the following month. This time, Morrison wrote in his accompanying note, "We'll make sure nobody calls 911 about the event beforehand. The Pine Valley Estates HOA elected me as their new president by unanimous vote, though I accepted the position with some reluctance and one important condition. Nobody calls the police unless there's an actual emergency," I announced at my first official meeting. "And if anyone has concerns about their neighbors, we talk to each other like adults before involving law enforcement." The community seemed more than happy to agree to those terms. 3 days before Prue's moving deadline, she made one final attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of her situation. She knocked on my door, looking smaller and more defeated than I'd ever seen her, and asked if we could talk. "I know I made mistakes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just want to understand how things went so wrong so fast." I invited her to sit on my porch, the same porch where this whole mess had started with her surveillance activities. "Prue," I said, "the problem wasn't that you were concerned about community safety. The problem was that you never bothered to find out who you were dealing with before you decided we were the enemy." I gestured toward the cabin, where my teammates and I had been having our innocent barbecue. "There are some people you should never mess with, especially when they're off duty and just trying to enjoy their day off. But more importantly, there are some lines you should never cross, like filing false reports that waste emergency resources and put other people at risk." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt," she said. "I just thought I was protecting everyone." That was probably true, I realized. The road to Prue's hell had been paved with good intentions and bad judgment. "The lesson here," I told her gently, "is simple. Before you call 911, make sure you actually have an emergency. And remember, the people you're calling the police on might be the same people who risk their lives to keep you safe." We all fear being misunderstood or unfairly targeted by those in power. Tank's story proves that truth and patience always triumph over paranoia and abuse of authority. Sometimes the people who seem most threatening are the ones protecting us all along. If this story reminded you that justice exists and good people still fight for what's right, show some love with a like and subscribe to Happer Stories. Share your own experiences with difficult neighbors below. You're not alone in these struggles. And your story matters too.
We appreciate you more than Karen appreciates a properly acted non. If you enjoyed this horror mess, drop a comment, hit like, and join Happer Story for more twisted tales of backyard battle and neighborhood drama celebrity is to win an Emmy.